On June 21, 1970, the golden era of the American railroad officially met its end with the bankruptcy of the Penn Central, a turbulent merger between several of the nation's most prestigious companies that was, at the time, the largest corporate bankruptcy filing in history. The collapse of the Penn Central, though, illustrated something far more than the corporate inefficiency of certain firms, an inherent flaw in the over-regulation of the railway companies that strangled their ability to compete, leading to the eventual deregulation of the American railroads, allowing them to strive for profitability on even terms with their rivals. As the name implies, the foundation of the Penn Central, formerly known as the Penn Central Transportation Company, was rooted in the two major railroads that were merged to create it, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central, together with the New York, New Haven and Hartford Railroad as a later addition to the original merger deal. The New York Central was one of America's most prestigious railroad companies, formed slowly between 1826 and 1853 by a number of formative railroads within New York State itself, including the Mohawk and Hudson, the Tonawanda and Utica, and Schenectady railroads, which were built to improve on the Erie Canal by offering faster, more efficient routes for passengers and goods. Rail development continued steadily, with several small lines connecting cities such as Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, and Albany, while mergers of these lines gradually formed a continuous route across the state, eventually leading to the formal establishment of the New York Central in 1853 as a consolidation of several regional lines led by Erastus Corning. The system continued to grow by absorbing struggling railroads, such as the Canandaigua and Niagara Falls Railroad, and key connections to the Hudson River and Niagara regions, while in the late 1860s, Cornelius Vanderbilt took control of the New York Central and oversaw the merger of the company with the Hudson River Railroad in 1869. This move solidified a direct route from New York City to Buffalo and further west, with Vanderbilt's acquisition extending the Central's reach to the Midwest and into Canada, with infrastructure developments including new urban bypasses and improved maintenance facilities, while the system's relatively flat terrain enabled faster and smoother journeys compared to its competitors. By the early 20th century, the New York Central became a symbol of modern rail travel, with its luxury trains, most notably the 20th Century Limited and the Empire State Express, offering speed, comfort and style, while streamlined trains introduced in the 1930s, such as the Mercury series, reflected cutting-edge design and technology, alongside the rapid adoption of diesels to replace steam in the 1940s. The Pennsylvania Railroad, meanwhile, emerged in the mid-19th century as a strategic response to the threats to Philadelphia's commercial dominance, particularly from the Erie and Chesapeake and Ohio canals, with the state initially creating the main line of public works, a mixed system of canals, railroads, and inclined planes linking Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, completed in 1834. However, this setup was inefficient, prompting a push for a more streamlined rail alternative, and in 1846, the Pennsylvania Railroad was chartered to build a direct line from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, outmaneuvering a rival proposal from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and under the guidance of engineer J. Edgar Thompson, the company selecting a route along the Susquehanna and Juniata rivers, crossing the Alleghenies via the Horseshoe Curve and the Galitzin tunnels, this line opening in phases, and was finally completed in 1854. In the following years, the Pennsylvania Railroad consolidated its hold on the corridor by acquiring and integrating existing infrastructure, such as the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad and the state-owned main line of public works in 1857, steadily replacing the canal systems and, by the late 19th century, having multiple tracks to manage heavy traffic, with acquisitions and leases across the Midwest, New Jersey and New York, seeing rapid expansion while maintaining consistent dividends until 1946. The railroad's growth beyond Pennsylvania was enabled by a revised charter in 1853, allowing investment in out-of-state lines, thus leading to significant stakes in Ohio and Indiana railroads and full acquisitions like the Cumberland Valley Railroad and Northern Central Railway, while the firm also created the Empire Transportation Company in 1865 to manage oil shipments, though conflict with Standard Oil forced its sale in 1877. The Pennsylvania Railroad reached New York via a lease of the United New Jersey Railroad and Canal Company in 1871 and expanded into Washington, D.C. through the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad, with a majority stake in the Philadelphia, Wilmington and Baltimore Railroad in the 1880s, further securing its dominance in the Northeast Corridor. It would eventually reach Chicago in 1869 by leasing the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne and Chicago Railway, before extending to St. Louis via the Panhandle route and the Vandalia Railroad, with low-grade lines being added to improve freight efficiency, these strategic investments helping to establish the Pennsylvania Railroad as the largest and most powerful rail company in the United States by the early 20th century. The company also pioneered electrification, beginning with the New York terminal area in 1910, with third rail DC systems initially being employed, before shifting to overhead AC electrification around Philadelphia in 1915, which became its standard. This electrification rapidly expanding to cover lines to Wilmington, Trenton, and Washington, and was supported by major federal funding during the New Deal. By 1938, the Pennsylvania Railroad had completed an eastern seaboard electrification program, resulting in a 2,677-mile network that remains the backbone of modern rail corridors, while freight car development was a cornerstone of the firm's operations, expanding from just 75 cars in 1849 to over 280,000 in 1919. However, while steam dominated into the mid-20th century, costly experimental designs and delayed dieselization hurt the railroad's competitiveness, with the adoption of diesel locomotives beginning in the 1930s, alongside electric locomotives such as the GG1, as introduced in 1935, which would go on to symbolize the company's engineering excellence. Finally, there was the New Haven Railroad, which began life as the Hartford and New Haven Railroad, Connecticut's first, in 1833, in order to improve inland transport by providing an alternative to the frozen Connecticut River in winter, with Alexander Catlin Twining leading the route planning, ultimately choosing a path through Meriden rather than Middleton due to terrain challenges. Service began in 1838, and by 1839 the line reached Hartford, before being later extended to Springfield, Massachusetts, creating a continuous route to connect with Boston via the Western Railroad, while the New York and New Haven Railroad, chartered in 1844, linked New Haven to New York by 1849, overcoming engineering difficulties on the Long Island Sound and securing access to Grand Central via trackage rights. Eventually, the two companies merged in 1872 to form the New York, New Haven and Hartford Railroad, known as the New Haven Railroad, the company rapidly absorbing various smaller lines to dominate rail transport across Connecticut, Rhode Island and southern Massachusetts, with major acquisitions including the Boston, New York and Airline Railroad in 1882, the New Haven and Northampton Railroad, and the Old Colony Railroad in 1893, which extended the network to Cape Cod and southeastern Massachusetts. In 1904, the New Haven reached its peak with the acquisition of the Central New England Railway, securing vital freight connections to the Midwest via the Poughkeepsie Bridge, its influence expanding through passenger partnerships with the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads, offering seamless travel to New York's major terminals. Much like the Pennsy, the New Haven was a leader in electrification, starting in 1907 with an 11,000-volt AC system between Woodlawn and Stamford. And despite early technical hurdles, the system expanded to support both commuter and intercity services, with over 673 miles electrified by the 1920s, while the company was also an early adopter of diesel technology, retiring steam by 1952 and introducing innovative equipment such as the dual-power FL9 locomotives. However, in spite of the New Haven's advances in technology, the company was also plagued by financial and managerial trouble, starting in 1903 under the influence of Charles S. Mellon and J.P. Morgan, which pursued an aggressive monopolistic expansion, acquiring steamship lines, trolleys, and regional railroads, this dominance leading to antitrust charges in 1914 and forced divestitures. The Great Depression deepened the crisis, prompting bankruptcy in 1935 and a long reorganization period, and while wartime demand brought a temporary recovery, the post-war competition from cars and lorries, combined with aging infrastructure and costly branch lines, led to declining revenues, compounded further by the opening of the Connecticut Turnpike in 1958, which severely hurt the railroad's viability. Leadership under Patrick McGinnis in the mid-1950s introduced flashy branding and aggressive cost-cutting, but financial mismanagement and natural disasters like the 1955 floods left the railroad in a worse condition, with service cuts and deferred maintenance continuing into the 1960s, including the end of passenger services on the Old Colony lines, while in 1961, the New Haven entered its second bankruptcy. It was very much the loss of the railroad's position as the monopolistic giant of American long-distance and short-distance travel that heralded the need for mergers such as the one that would result in the Penn Central, combined further by stringent regulation that had originally been designed to ensure the railroads did not exploit their domination of the market, but was now outdated and deeply unfair to their operations. By the late 19th century, railroads had become essential to the American economy, connecting regions and powering industrial growth, though the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 established the Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC, to regulate rates and operations, aiming to protect public interest but ultimately constraining railroad flexibility. By 1917, railroads employed 1.8 million people and operated over 254,000 miles of track, but increasing regulation and operational efficiencies marked the beginning of a long decline, with the Great Depression dealing a severe blow, halving revenues and pushing a significant portion of the network into receivership, though railroads were forced to continue unprofitable services due to ICC restrictions, and although World War II temporarily revived traffic, the post-war years brought renewed decline. Passenger services in particular suffered as cars, buses and planes captured the market, with increases in aircraft technology, boosted by wartime advances, rapidly maturing, and by the 1950s commercial aviation was thriving, with jet airliners like the Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8 redefining long-distance travel. At the same time, the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act authorized the vast interstate highway system, diverting both passengers and freight away from rail, with trucks gaining an edge in freight transport with door-to-door convenience and publicly funded infrastructure, while suburban sprawl and highway development eroded rail's urban base, the railroads, responsible for maintaining their own tracks without comparable federal support, being unable to compete. Regulatory burdens from the ICC compounded these problems, with innovation often being blocked or delayed, such as the case of the Southern Railway's high-capacity grain cars, while even in instances where railroads tried to modernize with unit trains or cost-saving infrastructure, approvals were slow and inconsistent. By the early 1960s, railroads began shedding passenger services, with iconic trains like the Olympian Hiawatha and 20th Century Limited being discontinued as ridership dropped and operational losses mounted, while attempts to modernize were undermined by rigid labor rules, outdated practices, and a refusal to adapt to modern consumer expectations. Key revenue sources like railway post office contracts were withdrawn, and stations were left to decay, while the demolition of New York's Pennsylvania station in 1965 symbolized the collapse of rail status in American life, and the loss of the California Zephyr in 1970 became a flashpoint, as public outcry over its cancellation highlighted the lack of a cohesive national transportation policy. Meanwhile, the freight sector consolidated in an attempt to survive, beginning with the 1960 Erie and Delaware-Lackawanna and Western merger to create the Erie-Lackawanna, while subsequent mergers, such as those forming Norfolk and Western and Seaboard Coastline, aimed to streamline operations, but also erased many historic railroad identities. By the mid-20th century, both the Pennsylvania and New York Central were in sharp decline, with the Pennsylvania having showed signs of trouble as early as 1946, while continuing to invest in passenger services despite falling demand and growing competition, all while the New York Central, though equally burdened, attempted to modernize under Alfred Perlman's leadership, implementing cost-cutting reforms, new marketing strategies, and pioneering container-based freight. Despite Perlman's efforts, the New York Central remained financially vulnerable, and with the Pennsylvania teetering on the brink of financial collapse as well, it became evident by September 1957 that the two railroads could possibly merge in order to secure their joint futures, a move that shocked many observers given the long-standing rivalry between the two firms. The prospect of merging two of the nation's largest and most competitive carriers seemed implausible, with Perlman, for his part, being skeptical of the Pennsylvania's stability and feared that a merger would entangle the New York Central in a financial disaster, both companies pursuing innovations and rationalization of their operations, which did little to stem their outgoings. By 1959, merger discussions between the Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central reached an impasse, and in a calculated move, Perlman withdrew from the talks, declaring that the merger was not in the public interest, this being widely interpreted as an attempt to pressure the Pennsylvania into offering more favorable terms, all while the New York Central explored alternative partnerships, including potential mergers with the Baltimore and Ohio and Chesapeake and Ohio railroads. In truth, the geographic and economic realities of the Eastern railroads contrasted sharply with the more favorable conditions enjoyed by their Western counterparts, with railroads like the Santa Fe and Union Pacific benefiting from long-haul routes, simpler operational structures, and less direct competition from trucking, thus allowing Western railroads to maintain profitability and invest in innovation, leaving struggling Eastern carriers like the New York Central at a competitive disadvantage. Industry observers speculated that a merger between an Eastern railroad such as the New York Central and a strong Western partner like the Santa Fe could have created a transcontinental system capable of rivaling trucks and the burgeoning airline industry, with a hypothetical New York Central-Santa Fe merger possibly being able to combine the strengths of both systems, with the New York Central extending its Flexivan intermodal expertise to western ports, and the Santa Fe leveraging its long-haul piggyback services to expand eastward. Such a combination could have offered shippers a seamless coast-to-coast network, fostering innovation and efficiency, and though some industry experts argued that the New York Central might have fared better by merging with a Western Railroad, or with the Chesapeake in Ohio and Baltimore in Ohio, these alternative partnerships never materialized. The CNO, which controlled the BNO by the early 1960s, declined to pursue a merger with the New York Central, citing concerns over the railroad's substantial debt and declining revenues, while other Western railroads were hesitant to assume the financial risk associated with the struggling Eastern carriers. In 1961, as financial and operational pressures mounted for railroads in the eastern United States, discussions about mergers gained momentum as a potential solution, with the Pennsylvania and New York Central railroads reopening negotiations about consolidating their operations, recognizing the potential benefits of creating a unified rail network that could adapt to the region's changing economic and transportation demands. The proposed merger envisioned a rail system that would span over 20,000 miles, supported by combined assets exceeding $4 billion and generating annual revenues projected at $1.5 billion, with this vast network being seen as a means to stabilize the financial health of both companies, improve operational efficiency, and maintain the critical role of rail transportation in the region. Proponents of the merger estimated annual cost savings of $150 million by eliminating duplicative infrastructure, such as overlapping tracks, terminals, and other facilities, though despite these promising prospects, the proposal faced notable challenges, including opposition from competing carriers concerned about diminishing market share, objections from local governments worried about potential tax revenue losses from reduced facilities, and resistance from labor unions, which anticipated significant layoffs and disruptions to employment. On March 9, 1962, following months of deliberation, the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads jointly submitted an application to the ICC seeking approval for their merger, with the companies proposing the new consolidated organization be christened the Pennsylvania New York Central Transportation Company, a title chosen to honor their respective histories while signaling their shared vision for a more robust and integrated rail system. The merger application included a detailed justification for their consolidation, outlining the expected operational and financial benefits that the unification would bring, not only to the railroads themselves, but also the public and the broader transportation industry, these companies turning to their shareholders for approval of the merger proposal following the application. On May 8, 1962, stockholders of both railroads overwhelmingly endorsed the plan, including the adoption of the proposed name for the merged entity, with the governance structure of the new organization being formalized with 14 board members being drawn from the Pennsylvania and 11 from the New York Central. To fulfill regulatory requirements, certified copies of the resolutions approved by the shareholders were promptly submitted to the ICC for review, and the Commission responded by scheduling formal hearings to begin on August 20, 1962, and aimed to determine whether the merger would serve the public interest, particularly by enhancing efficiency and reliability of rail operations. Justification for the merger went back to World War II, where railroads had transported more than 90% of all military freight and over 90% of troop movements within the United States, this efficiency, reliability, and capacity for rapid mobilization being key to the war effort and earned widespread national acclaim. This demonstrated the critical role railroads played in national defense, a role that could be further strengthened through consolidation, with a merged railroad system enhancing the ability to handle military transportation needs, streamline the flow of traffic, and improve infrastructure through better maintenance and accelerated technological advancements. The 1961 Doyle Report for the Senate Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce highlighted the strategic importance of consolidation, noting that in times of national emergency, the existence of a few well-coordinated railroad systems would enable the government to respond more effectively and could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The proposed merger between the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads was envisioned as a transformative step in addressing these challenges, aiming to create one of three major systems emerging in the East, forming the foundation of a more integrated and competitive transportation network. Additionally, the merger was seen as a means to enhance competition between railroads and other transportation systems, while enabling the acquisition of modern equipment and infrastructure, promising to safeguard employment opportunities within the railroad industry and its related sectors, promoting overall efficiency and encouraging technological advancements that would benefit the entire transportation industry. Beyond these operational improvements, the merger was projected to bring significant public benefits and would allow the railroads to better serve the communities and states along their routes, contributing to industrial development and expansion by creating a more stable and reliable source of revenue for state and local governments through taxes. Mobilizing railroad infrastructure would improve the speed and efficiency of service, while also generating jobs in supplier industries and providing additional funding for research and development. These enhancements not only benefiting the immediate stakeholders, but also contributing to the long-term sustainability of the railroads as critical components of the nation's transportation system. Then there was the matter of competition between the railroads and its aviation and highway rivals, with the period between 1946 and 1960 seeing aircraft experience a staggering 577% increase in intercity passenger traffic, offering faster and more convenient travel options for long distances, while cars also made substantial gains, carrying 268% more passengers and becoming the dominant mode of personal travel, supported by an expanding network of highways. In stark contrast, bus traffic fell by 22%, and railroad passenger traffic suffered a catastrophic decline of 68%, though the decline in railroad traffic had not been unprecedented, with 1943 seeing both the Pennsylvania and New York Central railroads individually exceed the total train miles operated by the two companies combined in 1960, highlighting the magnitude of their later contraction. The Pennsylvania Railroad alone maintained this superior train mileage performance as late as 1947, with 384 communities with populations exceeding 10,000 people being served by either the Pennsylvania, New York Central, or both railroads, while only 9 lacked service from another Class I railroad, thus indicating that railroads were still competing with one another even as they faced mounting external challenges. From 1949 onward, the railroads faced significant difficulties competing with other transportation sectors, despite the country's gross national product increasing by 55% during this period, with eastern railroads experiencing a 45% decline in car loadings, a 64% drop in passenger miles, and a 49% reduction in employment, while competing modes of freight and passenger transportation flourished. Between 1952 and 1960, intercity freight traffic overall increased by over 16%, yet this growth was unevenly distributed, with truck traffic surging by nearly 47% and river and canal traffic expanding by an impressive 94%, this being in stark contrast to the railroad freight volumes, which had declined by 7%, signaling a significant loss of market share. From 1955 to 1960, the financial health of Class I railroads deteriorated sharply, with net income decreasing by approximately $100 million annually, a reflection of broader challenges in the industry, with 1961 seeing eastern railroads carry a mere 12% of intercity ton-miles of freight, a steep decline from the 20% average recorded in the 1947 to 1949 period. This loss of freight traffic was further compounded by rising operational costs, with average yearly wages for railroad workers rising from $3,539 in 1947 to $6,426 in 1961, nearly doubling over the period, though despite these wage increases, railroads were unable to generate sufficient revenue to cover their fixed charges in both 1960 and 1961, signaling an industry in financial distress. Regulatory constraints hindered railroads from adapting their services and pricing to compete efficiently with other modes of transportation, with excessive taxation at state and local levels further straining the industry, creating an uneven playing field, while compounding this was the government's subsidization of alternative transportation infrastructure, including highways, waterways, and airways, which were built and maintained at public expense, allowing trucks, water carriers, and airlines to operate without the burden of infrastructure investment. Over the preceding decade, these pressures resulted in the loss of a combined 110,000 jobs, reflecting an average annual reduction of 11,000 positions, a stark decline that had occurred without meaningful safeguards for employees affected by these reductions, leaving workers vulnerable to job insecurity and financial hardship. Without the implementation of a merger, this downward trend in employment was expected to continue unabated, as both railroads struggled to compete with increasingly dominant alternate modes of transportation, and that by consolidating operations, the railroads anticipated creating opportunities to recover lost traffic, improve operational efficiency, and stimulate employment growth. A critical component of this revitalization involved modernizing infrastructure and investing in new construction projects, which would not only enhance the merged railroads' competitiveness, but also generate employment opportunities across various sectors, while capital improvements associated with the merger were expected to positively impact supplier industries, spurring economic activity and contributing to higher levels of employment in communities dependent on the railroads. Drawing on precedents such as the New Orleans conditions, the railroads outlined comprehensive plans to mitigate the impact of job reductions on workers, with these protections including financial guarantees for employees whose positions were downgraded, ensuring they would receive wage supplements to cover any income losses for a period of 5 years. For employees separated from service entirely, the provisions offered full earnings for up to 4 years, with minimum compensation of 60% of prior earnings for up to 5 years, contingent on factors such as length of service and timing of separation, with these protections being more generous than those found in most other industries and reflected the railroad's commitment to minimizing disruption for their workforce. For shippers, the merger offered the promise of enhanced service quality and efficiency without any reduction in the frequency of local freight service or the abandonment of the existing rail network, with the consolidation of the two railroads aiming to address long-standing inefficiencies and improve the speed and reliability of both local and long-haul shipments. These improvements were to be achieved through a combination of measures, including the use of the most efficient and direct routes, reductions in terminal delays through the adoption of advanced electronic classification yards, and the elimination of over 100 time-consuming interchange points. The long-term outlook for employment within the merged company was markedly optimistic, with the merger being projected to directly affect approximately 7,250 positions over a 5-year period, averaging around 1,400 positions annually across both railroads, these reductions being viewed as necessary adjustments to enable the consolidated railroad to achieve financial stability. Over a 10-year period, employment within the merged company was anticipated to exceed the combined levels of the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroad had they remained separate, an optimistic projection supported by expectations of increased traffic volumes, expanded capital projects, and the operational efficiencies made possible by the merger. An in-depth analysis of the route maps of the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads revealed numerous possibilities for enhancing traffic flow and improving operational efficiency, with one of the most significant advantages identified being the water-level route of the New York Central's main lines, which provided a direct and efficient pathway to New York, New England, and New Jersey. This route offered a distinct advantage for handling heavier freight tonnage by avoiding steep grades and reducing transit delays associated with floating operations, such as those on the Hudson River, while consolidation of passenger schedules would see them optimized to meet the requirements of various markets, allowing for more convenient and reliable services. Maintenance and shop operations would be reorganized to capitalize on the efficiencies of scale, ensuring the infrastructure was maintained at peak efficiency, the overarching goal of these operational adjustments being to provide superior transportation services at lower cost, which would strengthen the merged company's ability to meet the needs of its customers, employees, and shareholders, while contributing to the broader public good. Financial projections underscored the transformative potential of the merger, with estimates indicating annual pre-tax savings of over $75 million, with both railroads having maintained a significant overlap in their infrastructure and services, particularly in the densely industrialized regions of the East and the agriculturally rich Midwest, with nearly 100 locations being served directly by both railroads, leading to costly redundancies. The proposed merger sought to eliminate these inefficiencies through a series of coordinated measures, with facilities and infrastructure being integrated to reduce duplication, high terminal expenses being curtailed, and property taxes being lowered through the consolidation of redundant assets, while traffic would be concentrated on the most direct and economical routes, ensuring greater cost-effectiveness. However, in addition to the woes of the New York Central and Pennsylvania railroads, the New England region was also facing a disastrous fall in its traffic and financial stability. These issues arising from a combination of declining industrial activity in the region, increased competition from other modes of transportation such as highways and airways, and the inherent inefficiencies of operating multiple small and financially weak railroads. The consolidation of the New England railroads was seen as a viable solution to these problems, with unification allowing for the integration and streamlining of redundant facilities, operations, and services, resulting in a more efficient and financially robust system, but would require state governments, local communities, and employees to collaborate closely to address concerns regarding tax revenue, service availability, and job security. Recognizing the importance of such a merger, the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads voiced their support for unifying the New England Railroads, and in order to facilitate this process, the New York Central offered to release its Boston and Albany line for inclusion in the proposed merger, thus ensuring that all major trunk lines would retain equitable access to the key terminals and markets in New England, preventing any single railroad from dominating the region. However, the Pennsylvania and New York Central emphasized that any merger involving the New England's railroads must originate from within those companies, and while external railroads could support and encourage unification, The responsibility for initiating and advancing such a proposal rested with the New England Railroads themselves. Sadly, the approval process for the Penn Central merger was fraught with delays, largely due to the notoriously slow decision-making of the ICC, an inefficiency that was emblematic of the ICC's handling of other significant mergers at the time, such as the ongoing Rock Island case, with the ICC's protracted review for the Penn Central stretching over 6 years, creating profound uncertainty about whether the merger would ultimately occur. This lack of resolution made it nearly impossible for the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads to invest in the essential preparations needed for operational integration, and without the ability to develop cohesive plans, the merger's launch became a disorganized and chaotic endeavor, hampered by insufficient planning and coordination. However, even in spite of the questionable outcome of the merger process, there had long been criticisms of how a potential merger between the two railroads would unfold in practice, with 1958 having seen David P. Morgan highlight in an article published in Trains magazine 3 fundamental issues that plagued both the New York Central and Pennsylvania railroads: overwhelming debt burdens, consistently weak earning power, and a significant excess in capacity that neither railroad could afford to maintain. These challenges, already glaring in the 1950s, only intensified over the following decade, eroding both companies' ability to operate profitably, with financial data notably excluding the earnings from the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad, a New York Central subsidiary that had historically been one of the most profitable parts of the system, further underscoring the tenuous financial foundation of the parent companies. On January 4, 1968, the ICC approved the long-anticipated merger of the New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroads, setting the stage for a monumental transformation in American railroading. The official inauguration of the Penn Central Transportation Company taking place at 12:01 a.m. on February 1, 1968, in a modest ceremony at 30th Street Station in Philadelphia. The unveiling featured a simple but symbolic gesture, with a car foreman walking along track 1 to a business car marked Central and removing a cover to reveal the name Penn. Though despite the subdued nature, the ceremony reflected the weight of the moment, as well as the underlying tensions surrounding the merger, with Alfred E. Perlman, the former president of the New York Central, remaining in his private car during the event, while Stuart T. Saunders, the former president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, was notably absent. By the time the merger was finalized, Penn Central's scale and resources appeared on paper to signal a formidable enterprise, with the company's new headquarters being established at 6 Penn Center Plaza in Philadelphia, while the network spanned an impressive 20,583 route miles and 46,560 track miles, making it the most extensive privately owned rail system in the world. Penn Central employed 184,074 workers and managed an extensive fleet of 5,033 locomotives, 287,750 freight cars, and 8,551 passenger cars, with its total assets being valued at $5.659 billion, with projected revenues that seemed to promise stability and growth. The initial forecast being that the merged railroad was poised to dominate the transportation industry, offering unparalleled reach and capability. However, due to the length of time taken for the merger to take place, the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads were forced to proceed without adequate groundwork, and opted to merge their operating departments immediately upon the merger's effective date, with this approach being intended as a stopgap solution, relying on the assumption that the initial disruptions would resolve themselves over time, though it instead led to near-constant chaos across the newly unified system. The severity of the issues was highlighted in how classification clerks, untrained in the 5,000 new routing combinations introduced by the merger, caused widespread confusion, while freight cars were misrouted en masse, with many arriving at the wrong destinations or being delayed in transit, with one notable incident involving New York Central employees unfamiliar with Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, with a freight car intended for Harrisburg being mistakenly sent to Pittsburgh due to gaps in the knowledge and training among staff. In another particularly devastating case, the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad, a small regional line in northern Maine, suffered catastrophic financial losses due to Penn Central's mismanagement, this company having relied heavily on potatoes as a primary source of freight revenue, but by 1969, Penn Central's failure to manage shipments effectively led to an entire season's potato crop being stranded and ruined in Selkirk Yard. The merger also suffered from a toxic internal culture, with employees of the two former railroads, nicknamed Red Hats and Green Hats, struggling to work together, with deep-rooted rivalries and differing approaches undermining cooperation, while financial control was placed in the hands of David Bevan, whose connections kept Penn Central solvent in the short term, but the merger never delivered the efficiencies and profitability promised. During its first year of 1968, the Penn Central underwent intense structural, operational and financial changes as it attempted to solidify its position, with the company embarking on a vast program of infrastructure investment, corporate reorganization and diversification amid persistent operational problems and mounting financial pressures. The period saw a flurry of initiatives, including the unveiling of Penn Station's reconstruction, the launch of the Selkirk Yard, and the introduction of modern intermodal freight services like Trailvan, while high-speed rail efforts were spotlighted by the promotion and troubled rollout of the Metroliner, which faced delays and mechanical faults, particularly with Westinghouse-powered units. The Penn Central also struggled with management tensions, including labor disputes, particularly on the Long Island Railroad, and regulatory obstacles, with one notable feature of the year being the deepening financial crisis, with memos from executives warning of severe cash shortages, with eurodollar loan and commercial paper sales providing temporary relief, but operational efficiencies, including the unfinished Selkirk Yard and deteriorating commuter services, undermined the company's image and performance. Meanwhile, Penn Central aggressively pursued diversification into aviation, real estate and leisure, but these weren't always successful, with projects like the development of an office tower over Grand Central Terminal and the expansion of executive jet aviation drawing criticism and regulatory scrutiny, while a surge in non-rail profits masked declining rail revenue, and shareholders were kept optimistic by promotional efforts and leadership reassurances that the merger's promised efficiencies were materializing. Operationally, Penn Central consolidated facilities, abandoned unprofitable lines, and expanded intermodal freight capabilities, while continuing to cut passenger services amid declining demand, though the most pressing concern was a push by the ICC to have the Penn Central also incorporate the still-bankrupt New Haven Railroad in order to help bolster this major part of New England's railway scene. In February 1968, the New Haven received a $5 million loan from the Penn Central to continue operating, followed by additional loans of $4 million in both August and November, reflecting its deepening financial dependence, while throughout the year, regulatory and legal processes around the merger were slow and contentious, with the ICC ruling in November that Penn Central must acquire the New Haven by January 1, 1969, at a price of $145.6 million. The ruling dismissed the claims of New Haven's shareholders, effectively wiping out their investments, with the inclusion order also extending Penn Central's reach into New England by incorporating the Providence and Worcester and Norwich and Worcester railroads, though the Penn Central's management viewed the acquisition as a burden rather than a strategic gain, as the New Haven brought substantial deficits and declining passenger services. The company proposed a 40% reduction in the New Haven's long-distance passenger operations and began abandoning certain routes, such as the line between Laurel and Old Saybrook, Connecticut in March, while the states of Connecticut and New York established a joint contract to support and rehabilitate New Haven's commuter operations, acknowledging the regional importance of maintaining these services. On December 31, 1968, the Penn Central formally acquired the rail assets of the New York, New Haven and Hartford Railroad for $145.6 million, encompassing 1,502 route miles of track, 325 locomotives, 3,959 freight cars, and 660 passenger cars, along with an additional 28,000 daily commuters in New York and Boston. On the same day, Penn Central finalized its sale of its former New York Central holdings in the Strick Corporation and confirmed that offers from Burlington Industries and United States Steel to acquire executive jet aviation had been withdrawn, with 1968 seeing Penn Central report a 27% increase in net income, driven entirely by a 101% surge in earnings from its non-railroad subsidiaries, despite a growing passenger deficit that exceeded $100 million. The integration of the New Haven Railroad added complexity to an already cumbersome system going into 1969, and efforts to unify operations exposed deep incompatibilities in infrastructure, technology, and corporate culture, while the launch of the much-publicized Metroliner high-speed service between New York and Washington in January was intended to revitalize passenger rail travel and compete with air transport. However, the service was rushed into operation before technical issues had been resolved, with mechanical failures, power supply incompatibilities, and repeated service disruptions plaguing the Metroliner fleet, with some test runs triggering multiple outages and speed restrictions imposed to avoid further incidents, these issues reflecting deeper systemic problems with the railway's aging infrastructure and fragmented signaling system, which had never been fully integrated across the merged entities. Internally, Penn Central underwent extensive management reshuffling in an attempt to improve control and accountability, appointing new executives to oversee its various regions and support functions. But these changes did little to stem the tide of financial deterioration, with the company facing an increasingly severe cash flow crisis, forcing it to rely heavily on commercial paper and revolving credit agreements from banks, with borrowings growing to unsustainable levels. Key executives, including Vice President David Bevan, orchestrated complex and often opaque financial arrangements, including foreign loans routed through Liechtenstein-based trusts, in a last-ditch attempt to plug the growing gaps in liquidity. But despite these efforts, the company's projections for the year swung from a modest surplus to a forecast deficit of over $150 million by December. Labor relations also deteriorated sharply, with there being numerous disputes and slowdowns, especially on the Long Island Railroad, where equipment shortages, delayed maintenance and underinvestment in rolling stock led to widespread commuter dissatisfaction, with some services being suspended and others facing near-daily delays. Commuter groups organized protests and political pressure mounted for state intervention, while the company's reputation with passengers and shippers alike suffered, and the long-standing trust in the reliability of rail transport in the Northeast Corridor began to erode. At the same time, the company slashed or discontinued many of its long-distance passenger routes and mail trains, particularly west of Buffalo and Harrisburg, as they hemorrhaged money, some of these being replaced with minimal services, while others were abandoned entirely. On the freight side, Penn Central invested heavily in modernizing its operations, including upgrading major classification yards such as Selkirk and Conway, introducing centralized traffic control on key routes, and testing high-speed freight concepts, though many of these initiatives struggled to deliver results, while the company also pursued ambitious real estate ventures. One of these was to sell the air rights above the historic Grand Central Terminal, with the iconic head house being replaced by a 55-story office tower, though these plans became mired in legal battles with preservationists and the New York City Landmarks Commission following the demolition of the equally iconic Pennsylvania Station building in the mid-1960s, further complicating the company's public image and distracting from its core operational priorities. As the year progressed, Penn Central's financial house of cards began to wobble more visibly, with earnings declining quarter by quarter, union pressure intensifying over wage demands, and costs rising sharply due to inflation and interest payments, while a string of senior resignations and internal power struggles, particularly between President Alfred Perlman, Chairman Stuart Saunders, and Finance Vice President David Bevan, led to further instability. The company was also under regulatory scrutiny from the ICC, the Civil Aeronautics Board, and Congress, particularly for its conduct in the Metroliner rollout, its handling of commuter services, and its entanglements with aviation and real estate subsidiaries. By December, the situation had become untenable, with dividend payments being suspended for the first time in over a century, signaling the depth of the crisis to shareholders and markets, and despite launching automation projects like car tracing systems and adding new equipment to cope with rising freight volumes, the underlying business continued to deteriorate. These problems would continue into 1970, with the year beginning with organizational changes and deteriorating service, especially on commuter lines, while harsh winter weather compounded problems, with equipment failures, accidents, and service disruptions widespread. While amid the failing position of America's passenger railroad providers, the federal government unveiled rail pacts, later Amtrak, to rescue passenger rail, though initial proposals lacked presidential support. However, more troubling was the ballooning losses and a growing sense of panic among investors and lenders, with the Penn Central reporting first-quarter operating losses of $100 million and saw a dramatic fall in consolidated income, while its commercial paper, once a trusted short-term financing tool, was no longer viable as lenders refused to roll over maturing debt. Banks began withdrawing support, and institutional investors sold off stock, worsening the company's creditworthiness, with the situation becoming so dire that Penn Central had to seek funds overseas, resulting in high-interest loans backed by opaque and hastily created foreign subsidiaries like Penn Central International in Curacao, but these moves failed to restore market confidence. Efforts to secure domestic funding faltered, and a proposed $100 million debenture offering was withdrawn due to a lack of interest, while attempts to raise capital by selling off assets, including shares in other companies, fell short, and talks with the Nixon administration led to a proposed $225 million government loan guarantee under the Defense Production Act, but political pushback, especially from congressional figures wary of using federal funds to bail out a private company, stalled any progress. As banks backed away and no credible rescue plan materialized, Penn Central's liquidity crisis became unsustainable, and on June 21, 1970, with no options left, Penn Central filed for bankruptcy under Chapter 77, a move that sent shockwaves through the financial system, with the commercial paper market, where many companies relied on short-term loans to cover operating expenses, teetering on collapse. The Federal Reserve intervened by providing emergency liquidity to banks to avoid broader financial contagion, while in the immediate aftermath, Wall Street was rattled, and questions mounted about corporate governance, regulatory oversight, and the health of the rail industry. The collapse laid bare deep flaws in Penn Central's leadership, with executives having pursued speculative real estate and aviation investments through subsidiaries like Executive Jet Aviation, often using company funds with little accountability, while internal memos revealed concerns over insider trading, poor financial disclosure, and conflicts of interest. Congressional hearings began shortly after the filing, with former executives including Stuart Saunders and David Bevan facing intense scrutiny, while allegations of accounting irregularities and reckless financial practices dominated headlines, and the company's board was overhauled, with court-appointed trustees assuming control and were tasked with keeping operations running while developing a reorganization plan. By the end of 1970, Penn Central had posted a staggering $431.2 million loss, equivalent to losing over $1 million per day, and the scale of the collapse highlighted not only corporate mismanagement, but also the broader economic pressures facing American railroads, including competition from highways, airlines, and underinvestment in infrastructure. The bankruptcy also spurred federal action, and became a key catalyst for the creation of Amtrak, as policymakers acknowledged that intercity passenger rail could no longer be sustained by private companies alone. Going into 1971, a desperate scramble to address critical equipment shortages was being faced, prompting the conversion of aging New Haven multiple-unit cars into standard coaches, with these makeshift trains, plagued by frequent breakdowns and structural limitations, underscoring the company's deteriorating infrastructure and constrained resources. Simultaneously, leadership turnover saw several key figures depart or retire, while new executives were brought in under immense pressure to stabilize operations, all while the company's financial losses mounted rapidly, leading to drastic measures aimed at cutting costs. Services were scaled back or discontinued altogether, and Penn Central intensified its push to eliminate labor-intensive practices, such as crew size requirements. But as the losses deepened, the firm was forced to default on foreign loans, miss repayments on promissory notes, and engage in contentious negotiations with creditors, including Swiss banks. Federal intervention became crucial, and the Emergency Rail Services Act provided Penn Central with $100 million in loan guarantees, temporarily forestalling bankruptcy proceedings, while the launch of Amtrak on May 1st fundamentally reshaped passenger rail in the United States, slashing the number of operating trains and transferring most long-distance routes to the new national carrier. While this relieved Penn Central of a substantial burden, it retained responsibility for several commuter and mail routes, which remained under close regulatory scrutiny, and despite relinquishing intercity services, the company was still beset by public criticism and legal mandates to maintain certain lines, particularly in the Northeast Corridor. Meanwhile, Penn Central's internal problems came under the spotlight, with a string of scandals including missing boxcars discovered in a repainted state, fraudulent property deals, and misallocated pension funds, revealing a culture of mismanagement, with trustees filing lawsuits against former executives, including David Bevan, alleging tens of billions of dollars in financial misconduct. The SEC also pursued action against Penn Central's subsidiary, Great Southwest Corporation, for inflating earnings through improper accounting practices, while in a bid to stay competitive, Penn Central expanded its trail van intermodal freight service, introduced bar cars on commuter lines, and undertook infrastructure improvements such as high-level platforms and the refurbishment of freight yards. It also launched overnight express services, targeted short-haul freight routes, and began using modern materials like polycarbonate Lexan for carriage windows, though these modernization efforts were consistently undercut by a lack of capital, aging rolling stock, and delayed equipment deliveries. The broader economic environment added further strain, with President Nixon's new economic policy, introduced in August, suspending the dollar's convertibility into gold, imposing a 90-day freeze on wages and prices, and enacting protectionist tariffs, leading to surging inflation, interest rates rising, and industrial unrest becoming widespread. Labor relations within the rail industry grew increasingly tense, with wage demands, strikes, and federal injunctions dominating the latter half of the year, and despite efforts to negotiate wage increases, particularly for unionized rail workers, cost pressures mounted as Penn Central's payroll obligations ballooned. Amtrak, for its part, worked to distinguish itself from its predecessor, launching new branding, rolling out refurbished stock, reopening stations, and introducing discounted fares and new services, though performance was mixed, with many of its trains running late and initial timetables being cobbled together in haste, while legacy railroads like the Southern Railway continued to operate Back at Penn Central, the company's trustees continued to pursue a radical downsizing of the firm, proposing the abandonment of thousands of miles of unprofitable track and the sale of real estate assets, including air rights above rail yards and central terminals, while at the same time seeking regulatory relief, including the repeal of full crew laws in several states and press for rate increases and infrastructure subsidies. By December 1971, Penn Central had exhausted most of its emergency federal loan and was relying heavily on asset sales and short-term borrowing to maintain operations, while ongoing litigation, regulatory resistance and deteriorating market conditions further hampered recovery efforts, the company closing out the year still teetering on the edge of collapse and being increasingly reliant on government support and aggressive restructuring to avoid total liquidation. In 1972, Penn Central intensified its restructuring efforts by reorganizing its intermodal freight division, treating it as a standalone profit center, and appointed new leadership to oversee the expanded focus on containerized and piggyback transport, while several of its smaller trucking subsidiaries were merged into Pennsylvania truck lines, streamlining operations under a unified brand. To generate liquidity, Penn Central sold major properties including the landmark New York General Building and other prime real estate holdings, raising tens of billions of dollars to offset mounting losses, while Amtrak, still in its formative phase after assuming responsibility for intercity passenger rail the previous year, worked to modernize and rationalize its services. It would expand the Metroliner high-speed corridor, reinstate sleeper services, launch new branding efforts, and introduce the Potomac Turbo Train and other experimental services, though not all were suited to their assigned routes, while international services were introduced, and the network gradually extended westward and into Canada. Legal scrutiny around Penn Central deepened considerably, with former top executives facing criminal charges for diverting corporate funds into side ventures, including executive jet aviation and Penn Phil, with arrests and grand jury proceedings making headlines, while the SEC conducted a far-reaching investigation into the company's internal practices, exposing reckless financial decisions and allegations of insider trading. The SEC ultimately shifted the narrative away from outright fraud and placed emphasis on systemic mismanagement, particularly the company's aggressive diversification strategy and unsustainable reliance on short-term borrowing through commercial paper. Labor relations were fraught, with the United Transportation Union resisting crew size reductions and challenging proposed changes to long-standing work rules, and while arbitration was sought to avoid prolonged disputes, only partial progress was made, with interim deals allowing the elimination of some positions through attrition, but unions demanded compensatory pay rises that cancelled out much of the projected savings. Meanwhile, Penn Central pressed forward with operational upgrades, investing in yard modernization projects such as the expansion of Bayview Yard and implementing centralized traffic control to improve efficiency and throughput. Midway through the year, Tropical Storm Agnes delivered a devastating blow, with the storm flooding vast stretches of track, wiping out bridges, including the Shocks Mills Bridge over the Susquehanna River, and submerging entire yards, halting operations across Pennsylvania and parts of New York, with damage totaled at more than $20 million, and thus further deepening Penn Central's financial hole. Recovery efforts involved leasing hundreds of locomotives and boxcars, initiating rapid repairs, and rerouting freight to maintain essential service, while in response to its deepening crisis, Penn Central's trustees submitted a reorganization plan that proposed reducing the railroad system from 20,000 to 15,000 miles, abandoning many low-traffic routes, and eliminating thousands of jobs. The trustees also advocated for targeted government support without full nationalization, suggesting federal ownership of key infrastructure such as rights-of-way and government-backed loans to keep freight moving. And though the plan indicated small financial improvements and stabilized performance in certain areas, the overall outlook remained bleak. By the end of the year, Penn Central accelerated cost-cutting measures, reduced crew sizes further, disaffirmed unviable contracts, and discontinued unprofitable services and stations. And while operational metrics improved, with complaints being significantly down and the operating ratio having edged into better territory, these gains were insufficient to offset continuing monthly losses. Meanwhile, a Senate subcommittee attributed Penn Central's failure to both structural industry issues and internal mismanagement, calling for the creation of a publicly owned Northeast Transportation Authority to take over struggling regional lines. Going into 1973, the Penn Central attempted to maintain operations through increasing dependence on emergency loans and government subsidies, with trustees warning that the company would run out of working capital by early 1974, prompting urgent appeals for federal assistance, while efforts to reorganize were hampered by aging infrastructure, deferred maintenance, and a shrinking customer base as freight and passenger volumes declined. At the same time, the company faced pressures from creditors, legal proceedings over mismanagement, and labor disputes threatening strikes over wages and job security, with the Long Island Railroad strike, which became the longest commuter rail strike in American history, underscoring the fragility of the broader rail network. In response, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority took over ownership of key Boston area rail corridors and began subsidizing commuter services, while New Jersey created a state transit agency and used toll revenues to underwrite rail operations, or while Amtrak expanded services despite reduced federal funding, absorbing Metroliner reservations, introducing new routes like the Aliney and the Valley Forge, and purchasing new locomotives and refurbished rolling stock. Nevertheless, Amtrak struggled with poor track conditions, particularly on Penn Central-owned routes, forcing detours and service cuts, while several passenger trains were discontinued or rerouted, as the company worked to balance cost, ridership, and reliability. Nationally, the broader economic climate was increasingly hostile, with the United States slipping into recession, resulting in unemployment rising and inflation accelerating, while wage and price controls were lifted in stages throughout the year, stoking volatility. In October, the Arab oil embargo in response to American support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War sparked the energy crisis, causing oil prices to quadruple, long queues at petrol stations, and a renewed public and political focus on public transport as an alternative to car dependency, with railroads and transit systems suddenly finding themselves at the center of energy policy despite years of neglect and underfunding. Amid this turmoil, Congress debated multiple competing plans to reorganize the Northeastern Rail Network, including consolidation of the bankrupt railroads into a single federally managed system, forming public-private partnerships, and establishing a new holding company to oversee liquidation and asset sales, though political consensus proved difficult as the Nixon administration favored market-based solutions, while Senate leaders like Vance Hartker pushed for direct federal control. The Watergate scandal, which escalated throughout the year, undermined the administration's credibility and diverted attention from pressing infrastructure issues, while despite the approval of emergency appropriations, by December 1973, Penn Central's operations were still in jeopardy, with trustees presenting a reorganization plan while simultaneously warning of complete shutdown if aid was not secured. The Interstate Commerce Commission and the Department of Transport were caught between enforcing safety standards and preserving essential systems, or while several subsidiaries filed for bankruptcy, services were cut or consolidated, and even major terminals like Cincinnati Union Terminal faced partial demolition. In the background, other developments reflected the shifting landscape, with the Clean Air Act reducing coal demand and thus hitting rail freight revenues hard, while major state projects such as New York's Transportation Bond Initiative collapsed under voter rejection, delaying upgrades. Going into 1974, the year opened with sweeping changes triggered by the Federal Regional Rail Reorganization Act, or 3R Act, which laid the groundwork for the creation of the Consolidation Rail Corporation, or Conrail, a government-backed entity tasked with salvaging the region's viable freight operations, while the U.S. Railway Association, or USRA, established to oversee this transition, was given unprecedented authority to develop and implement a system plan, marking a decisive shift in federal rail policy. At the same time, Amtrak saw dramatic growth in passenger numbers due to the ongoing energy crisis, with Metroliner and Northeast Corridor services reporting double-digit increases in ridership, with this surge prompting the purchase of new passenger cars and the expansion of long-distance and regional routes. Leadership instability continued to plague the Penn Central, though, as President William H. Moore was removed in January, having failed to enact crucial cost-cutting reforms, while his successor, Jervis Langdon, faced an immediate uphill battle, attempting to secure emergency funding while navigating fierce internal disagreements and mounting legal threats. As part of its strategy to build public and political support for federal assistance, Penn Central released a stark promotional film, Penn Central 1974, highlighting the company's dire condition and the broader implications of letting it fail, all while derailments surged to alarming levels, with over 1,100 in February alone, thus reflecting the impact of years of deferred maintenance. Nearly 8,500 miles of track were under slow orders by March, including almost 5,000 miles of mainline routes, and several sections of track were deemed so unsafe that Amtrak and freight trains were rerouted or cancelled, and entire lines were removed from service. The railroad's financial position became increasingly unsustainable, with Penn Central repeatedly deferring payments on equipment trusts and loans, exercising grace periods, and requesting emergency grants from the Department of Transportation, while trustees returned to court seeking federal intervention to prevent total collapse. In response, the special court created under the 3R Act began hearing key cases, including disputes over the Act's fairness and compensation arrangements for asset transfers to Conrail, with these legal battles, which involved stakeholders, creditors, and former executives, delaying progress and clouding the future of the reorganization effort. Efforts to modernize commuter services proceeded despite these setbacks, with the new Silverliner 4 electric multiple units being introduced by SEPTA, while Penn Central deployed the first Jersey Arrow 2 cars on the South Amboy route, and Amtrak expanded its intercity offerings, taking over several services from Penn Central, upgrading amenities, and initiating the Adirondack service between New York and Montreal. Test runs of modified Metroliner equipment achieved speeds of up to 152 miles an hour, and the first E60 CP electric locomotives entered service, intending to replace the GG1s, though frequent mechanical issues, deferred infrastructure repairs, and limited maintenance capacity continue to undermine performance. National events soon overtook the rail crisis, with President Richard Nixon resigning in August following the Watergate scandal, and attention briefly shifting from transport policy to political fallout, though regardless, the Penn Central remained mired in legal and financial turmoil as former executives faced SEC investigations and criminal indictments related to pre-bankruptcy misconduct, including fraudulent stock sales and unauthorized fund transfers to overseas accounts. Meanwhile, the SEC filed charges against Penn Central and key individuals for misleading investors and mismanaging company funds, all while economic conditions deteriorated sharply throughout the second half of the year, with inflation reaching 12.1% by December, unemployment climbing above 6.5%, and interest rates surging, further choking Penn Central's ability to borrow or refinance debt. Freight traffic declined significantly, especially in coal and automobile shipments, exacerbated by strikes and economic slowdown, and while the Penn Central deferred further equipment payments and warned of a projected $85 million cash shortfall by early 1975, its daily losses were approaching $1 million, with infrastructure damage from derailments and weather events increasing, and operations remained unstable. Amid the turmoil, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in December that the 3R Act was constitutional, overturning an earlier district court decision, thus clearing a critical legal hurdle and allowing the USRA to proceed with Conrail's creation, though questions of asset valuation and compensation remained unresolved, with stakeholders signaling their intent to sue the government over perceived underpayment for transferred property, though nevertheless, Conrail would be officially incorporated by the end of the year, setting the stage for a full federal takeover of Penn Central's core freight operations. Entering 1975, and with the Penn Central's cumulative losses having surpassed $1 billion since its 1970 bankruptcy filing, a national economic recession was ravaging the United States, with unemployment rising to 9.2%, its highest level since the 1940s, prompting aggressive federal intervention, not only to stabilize the general economy, but to address the increasingly fragile state of the Northeastern Rail network. Congress responded by passing a series of emergency funding bills aimed at keeping the bankrupt railroads, especially Penn Central, operational, including direct cash payments, federally guaranteed loans, and legislative reforms, while the USRA released both its preliminary and final system plans, detailing how the assets of multiple insolvent railroads would be reorganized into the new government-backed Conrail. The proposed plan recommended abandoning over 6,000 miles of track and transferring only profitable or essential lines into Conrail structure, triggering significant backlash from state governors, mayors, shippers and communities that depended on rail access, who argued that the plan would cut off regions from vital economic links and reduce competition in freight markets. In a desperate bid to remain viable, Penn Central pursued the sale of its real estate and rail assets, with high-profile transactions, including the sale of valuable land in Manhattan to developer Donald Trump, and negotiations with the Chessie system over the purchase of key freight lines, while the company also petitioned for federal permission to sue the American government, alleging that the forced operation of unprofitable services during bankruptcy had unlawfully eroded its estate by over $1 billion. The trustees fiercely opposed the USRA's asset valuations, claiming the properties being absorbed into Conrail were worth several times more than the official estimates, while at the same time they contended with a deteriorating cash position, repeated wage payment crises, and legal challenges from creditors and employees. The year was marked by intensifying debate around the balance between fiscal discipline and public service, with controversial fare increases on commuter lines sparking public outcry, particularly in New Jersey and New York, where rising costs collided with deteriorating service, and the fight to preserve Grand Central Terminal drew national attention and became a touchstone for the growing historic preservation movement, fueled in part by the advocacy from Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and architect Philip Johnson. By December, the landscape was shifting, with Congress passing a $6.5 billion rail rescue package, securing funding for the launch of Conrail, Amtrak upgrades, and stabilization of the broader rail network, with this legislation marking a decisive moment in American rail history, confirming that private capital alone could no longer sustain intercity rail in the northeastern United States. Finally, going into 1976, the American rail industry entered a period of profound upheaval driven by financial collapse, extensive government intervention, and a sweeping reorganization of both freight and passenger networks, with New Jersey responding to a growing budget deficit by announcing a 5% reduction in its state payroll and stepped up security across rail terminals in the aftermath of a deadly bombing at LaGuardia Airport. At the same time, a brutal winter brought severe disruption to rail operations across the Northeast, with frozen switches, power failures, and widespread delays exposing the fragility of the aging infrastructure and poor maintenance practices. Amidst this turbulence, Penn Central trustees, facing enormous debt and crumbling physical infrastructure, sought to restructure internationally through a proposed Canadian subsidiary, the Canada Connecting Railway, but this effort was ultimately blocked by Canadian regulators. In a crucial legislative moment, Congress passed the Railroad Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act, known as the 4R Act, allocating more than $6 billion in funding, including $2.1 billion in loans for the creation of Conrail, $1.75 billion to upgrade the Northeast Corridor, and further billions to assist other struggling railroads, these measures aiming to address years of neglect, rationalize rail services, and revive a falling but essential mode of transport. Penn Central's infrastructure remained in dire condition, with over 8,000 miles of track under slow orders, while failures at critical power stations such as Cos-Cob in Connecticut, combined with increasing derailments, highlighted the scale of the crisis, with the U.S. Department of Transportation being forced to cover principal payments on Penn Central debt, while the trustees paid only the interest. In a sign of growing federal control, Amtrak assumed responsibility for maintaining key terminals and stations, further consolidating its role in managing the passenger rail network, while Conrail began operations on April 1, 1976, officially ending the fragmented and bankrupt state of several northeastern and midwestern railroads. Conrail would inherit 17,000 miles of track, 95,000 employees, more than 4,800 locomotives, and over 160,000 freight cars, though many were in poor condition, with the first day of the company's operation seeing 10% of its locomotives already out of service, while its launch was also marked by the immediate abandonment of 3,000 miles of low-density or unprofitable lines and the establishment of 8 regional divisions to oversee operations. A key feature of this reorganization was the transfer of the Northeast Corridor's primary passenger lines, including the Philadelphia to Harrisburg route and the New Haven to Springfield line, to Amtrak for $87 million, while Conrail retained limited freight rights. Elsewhere, smaller railroads like the Delaware and Hudson expanded their operations, acquiring trackage rights to preserve competition in the face of Conrail's dominance, and other short lines, such as the Hillsdale County Railway and the Michigan Northern Railway, took over abandoned routes in a bid to maintain local freight and passenger services. In the end, Conrail's first year was marked by both progress and loss, as although it replaced nearly 2.8 million ties, resurfaced thousands of miles of track, rebuilt hundreds of locomotives, and refurbished thousands of freight cars, it still reported an operating loss of $205 million and was forced to lease locomotives from other carriers while remaining reliant on federal subsidies. Conrail finalized the abandonment of several damaged or marginal lines, including those closed since Hurricane Agnes in 1972, and began consolidating staff across a more centralized infrastructure, while the Penn Central reorganization plan, submitted late in the year, focused on liquidating rail-related assets and leveraging the company's remaining real estate holdings, particularly in Manhattan, proposing the resolution of outstanding claims with creditors, governments, and federal agencies, setting the stage for the company's transformation into a non-rail holding firm. However, despite receiving billions in federal support through the Regional Rail Reorganization Act and subsequent legislation, Conrail accumulated over $2.2 billion in operating losses by 1982, and at times was losing up to $1 million per day, a major factor in Conrail's early struggles being the suffocating regulatory environment imposed by the ICC, with freight rates being tightly controlled, and the company often being required to continue operating money-losing routes, unable to set prices that reflected market conditions or respond quickly to changes in demand. The passage of the Staggers Rail Act in 1980 marked a turning point, with this legislation giving railroads unprecedented freedom to set their own rates, abandon unprofitable lines, and tailor services to commercial realities, while the Northeast Rail Service Act of 1981 lifted Conrail's state tax burden and formalized the transfer of its own commuter rail obligations to Amtrak and various state and local authorities, allowing Conrail to restructure with greater focus and flexibility. L. Stanley Crane, appointed CEO in 1981, was instrumental in transforming the company's fortunes, Crane being a seasoned executive with a strong background at the Southern Railway, who implemented sweeping cost-cutting measures, modernized operations, and reduced the network by more than 4,000 miles on lines that accounted for only a tiny fraction of revenue, but consumed a disproportionate share of maintenance costs. His strategy was rooted in prioritizing profitable freight corridors, streamlining staff and resources, and upgrading key infrastructure to improve reliability and efficiency. And by 1983, Conrail turned a profit for the first time, and maintained steady earnings growth throughout the rest of the decade. In 1987, after a failed acquisition attempt by Norfolk Southern, the US government took Conrail public in what was, at the time, the largest initial public offering in the history of the New York Stock Exchange, with the $1.65 billion sale being widely seen as a landmark moment, both in terms of rail industry reform and as a model for successful government divestment, demonstrating how a deeply troubled public enterprise could be revived and transitioned into a viable private sector business through a combination of legislative support, managerial competence, and market-driven strategy. By the early 1990s, Conrail had cemented its place as a leading freight operator in the Northeast, with one of the strongest pillars of its business being coal transportation, the company adapting to shifts in energy consumption patterns, particularly the move by large utility companies to reduce on-site coal stockpiles and rely on precisely timed deliveries. Conrail responded by refining its unit coal train operations, with long standardized trains dedicated to single customers or destinations, loaded with low-sulfur coal from West Virginia and southwestern Pennsylvania, while its 1993 acquisition of the Monongahela Railroad gave Conrail direct access to some of the largest underground coal reserves in the country, further strengthening its position in the energy supply chain. Conrail deployed some of the most powerful locomotives available, including the SD-80 Max, a model built specifically for the company, with these engines, combined with advanced scheduling, allowing it to haul enormous trains across difficult terrain with improved efficiency, while its operational model also shifted from complex handovers and local deliveries to a direct mine-to-plant service, cutting time and costs. When the 1990 recession hit, Conrail took early action to cushion the blow, temporarily sidelining surplus equipment, rationalizing services, and tightly controlling expenses, while also repurchasing a third of its stock in 1990 to stave off hostile takeovers, followed in 1991 by its share price having nearly tripled from its post-IPO value, illustrating strong investor confidence and sound fiscal management. As the decade progressed, industry consolidation reshaped the US rail freight landscape, and by 1995, Conrail stood as one of the last major independent carriers in the eastern half of the country, competing with CSX and Norfolk Southern for control of key routes between the Midwest and the Atlantic, with 1996 seeing CSX and Conrail announce plans to merge, catching Norfolk Southern off guard. A bidding war ensued, with Norfolk Southern ultimately joining forces with CSX to purchase and divide Conrail's assets, with Norfolk Southern securing the lion's share of 58% of the network, including vital segments of the former Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads, while CSX claimed the rest, including strategic east-west corridors from Boston to St. Louis. The breakup was approved by federal regulators in 1998 and implemented the following year, with Conrail's operations being split between two subsidiaries, the New York Central Lines and Pennsylvania Lines, which were leased to CSX and Norfolk Southern respectively, though in order to preserve competitive balance in dense urban markets, Conrail's shared asset operations was established to provide joint access to key terminals in Detroit, North Jersey, and Philadelphia. Though Conrail, as an independent entity, ceased to exist in 1999, its legacy lived on through locomotives wearing its blue quality livery for years after their integration into CSX and Norfolk Southern's fleets, while the company's influence was also felt in signal standardization, having pioneered the adoption of NORAC operating rules and contributed to the modernization of rail signaling across the Northeast, laying the foundation for continued success under its successor companies. However, the question remains even to this day as to whether the Penn Central could have survived had the necessary action been taken to secure its future early on, though from the outset, the merger was fraught with practical and cultural difficulties, with the two formative railroads having different operating philosophies, incompatible technologies, and decades of mutual rivalry. Rather than creating a single coherent system, Management chose to divide the new network geographically between the old firm's existing systems, with the Pence's Univac computers in one area and the New York Central's IBM system in another, leading to frequent miscommunication, misplaced freight, and inefficient train movements, while the customer base, already shifting to trucks and airlines, quickly lost confidence, further eroding the company's fragile revenue stream. The situation worsened with the forced inclusion of the New Haven Railroad into the merger, adding a layer of dysfunction, combined with the burden of union agreements that guaranteed lifetime employment for some staff, that left the company with very little flexibility to adjust its workforce or restructure operations, while the Penn Central also faced heavy property tax bills, particularly in the high-tax states of the Northeast, which further strained its balance sheet. Instead of focusing on stabilizing the core railroad business, Penn Central's leadership invested heavily in non-rail ventures, particularly speculative real estate, in a bid to generate quick profits, with many of these projects, including high-profile developments in Manhattan, failing to deliver returns and only deepening the company's financial woes. And as the manufacturing base in the Northeast contracted and demand for freight services dwindled, Penn Central found itself unable to adapt, hemmed in by outdated infrastructure, unsustainable fixed costs, and regulatory restrictions that prevented the abandonment of unprofitable routes or the repricing of freight services to reflect actual market demand. Some analysts argue that if the regulatory reforms introduced in the 1970s, most notably the 4R Act of 1976 and the Staggers Act of 1980, had come earlier, Penn Central might have had a fighting chance, with these laws later enabling Conrail to abandon money-losing routes, renegotiate labour contracts, and set competitive rates. Other analysts believe that if the merger had excluded the New Haven, or had been executed earlier before the decline had become irreversible, the combined company might have had a more solid foundation. But these are speculative scenarios that overlook the depth of the challenges Penn Central inherited and the external economic pressures it could not control. Ultimately, Penn Central's downfall accelerated long overdue reforms, with Conrail's eventual success, built on regulatory flexibility, government support, and a leaner operating model, underscoring the extent to which Penn Central had been paralyzed by outdated rules and internal dysfunction. And though its collapse was dramatic, it forced the industry and policymakers to confront the realities of a changing transportation landscape, with the Penn Central becoming a symbol of institutional failure and a powerful reminder of the need for strategic alignment, effective integration, and the capacity to respond to shifting market forces.